Hello everyone, Pastor Howie here with a continuation of readings and thoughts from the scriptures. We come today to the end of Acts chapter 22 and the first 11 verses in chapter 23. Again, we are kind of amazed at how the contextual paragraphs or even sentences are interrupted by chapter and verse changes, but so be it. What we find here is Paul is in Jerusalem. He has been arrested. He was going to be interviewed or interrogated after being beaten by the Romans until he mentioned that he is a Roman citizen. And ask the question, simple question, is it legal for you, is it lawful for you to scourge a man without being a Roman citizen who has not been charged and had a chance to explain himself? And that created a certain amount of concern in the Roman centurion and his commander. So here is the next part of this. And here, beginning in Acts chapter 22, verse 30, we find Paul being brought before the Sanhedrin. So let's read it and see how God moves through Paul's life in this episode that we're in the middle of. This episode of him being arrested and ultimately finding his way to Rome under Roman guard, not as a prisoner necessarily, but as a Roman citizen, a citizen of the kingdom of heaven foremost, and under guard, protected until he is able to appeal his case before Caesar. So, chapter 22, book of Acts, verse 30. And then continuing into verse 11 of chapter 23. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Now some might say, well, okay, he didn't realize he was the high priest. How is it that he didn't realize he was the high priest? Ananias was involved in, I'm sure, in the crucifixion of Christ. Caiaphas was the high priest then. Now it's Ananias. But here's what happens. The high priesthood was more of a political office at this point in the history of Israel. And so they would have a high priest that served for a while, and then they would have another high priest either elected or appointed at the whim of not only the Sanhedrin itself, but even at the whim of the Jewish governors of Judea and Jerusalem, who were in league with King Herod, the Herodian dynasty, if you will, and they were in league with the Romans, and so there was a whole lot of political intrigue and deals being made and positions being elevated or positions being evacuated, who knows. Anyway, the story goes on. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, and so Paul knew this because he at one time was a member of the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin was just like in many places around the world. Here in the United States, Congress is divided between essentially two parties, Democrats and Republicans. And the Sanhedrin was divided also between two parties. I shouldn't say represented perhaps by two parties. And that was the party of the Pharisees, who were very religious, very spiritual, very scripturally interested, and therefore very conservative. And the Sadducees, who I guess we wouldn't coin them as liberal necessarily, but they were not spiritual. They were very secular. And in that sense, when it came to the scriptures, when it came to the traditions of Israel, they were less conservative. They're the ones that didn't believe in a resurrection. So Paul knew some were Sadducees, others Pharisees. So he called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. And Luke puts in parentheses, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits. But the Pharisees believe all these things, and parentheses. And so Luke is explaining to us what I already stated. The Sadducees were not Bible believing. They were not scripturally based in their politics and their representation of the Jewish people in the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees were. They were believers in the scriptures. They read the scriptures. They attended synagogue. They studied the scriptures. They knew the scriptures, and they believed what they read. So this goes on in verse 9. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So now he's not being arrested, he's being protected by the Romans. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Here's the plan of God being revealed to Paul as the Lord comforts him and encourages him. And as we read the scriptures, we may find glimpses and we may find movements in our hearts and in our spirits of the Lord, reading the word of the Lord, revealing to us God's plans in our lives. And wherever we are encouraged to take courage and to testify about Christ, whether it's at home in Jerusalem, so to speak, or out in the world, such as Paul being revealed to it being revealed to Paul here that it's God's intention for him to bear witness to Jesus in the very capital city of the Roman Empire. So that's what I have for you today in this portion from the book of Acts, Acts chapter 22, verse 30 through 23, verse 11. So until then, take courage. God is with us.